The wind carried whispers of death across the howling plains that fateful summer of 18. Even the bravest warriors of the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes felt the chill that penetrated their bones as they gathered along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Known to them as the greasy grass, the spirits of their ancestors seemed to dance in the tall prairie grass, warning of the bloodshed that would soon stain the earth crimson and create legends that would echo through eternity. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer adjusted his buckskin jacket as he studied the rolling hills through his field glasses. The golden-haired cavalry officer, known among his men as Long Hair, had built his reputation on bold strikes against Native American villages. His 7th Cavalry Regiment, battle-hardened from years of frontier warfare, awaited his command with the confidence of soldiers who had never known true defeat. The morning sun of June 25th cast long shadows across the Montana Territory, shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers reaching toward an uncertain destiny. In the sprawling encampment below, thousands of Native American warriors prepared for what many sensed would be their final stand against the relentless westward expansion of the white man's civilization. Sitting Bull, the revered holy man and war chief of the Hunkpapa Lakota, had received visions of soldiers falling into camp like grasshoppers from the sky. His spiritual power had united tribes that had rarely fought together, creating an alliance that numbered nearly 3,000 warriors. The legendary Crazy Horse, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of cavalry soldiers, moved among his Oglala warriors like a ghost, his face painted for war, his presence commanding respect and inspiring fierce loyalty. The encampment stretched 4 miles along the river valley, a testament to the unprecedented gathering of Plains Indian tribes. Lodosa, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho dotted the landscape like scattered flowers, their smoke rising peacefully into the morning air. Children played among the horses while women prepared meals, seemingly oblivious to the approaching storm. Yet, beneath this veneer of normal life, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Warriors checked their weapons, painted their faces with sacred symbols, and performed ceremonies that would prepare their spirits for the journey to the afterlife. According to historical accounts preserved by the National Park Service, the stage was set for one of the most significant battles in American frontier history. The U.S. government's policy of forcing Native American tribes onto reservations had reached a critical juncture, and the discovery of gold in the Black Hills had intensified pressure to remove the Lakota from their sacred lands. General Philip Sheridan had devised a 3-pronged campaign to corner the hostile tribes and force their surrender. But the Native American coalition that had gathered at the Little Bighorn represented something unprecedented in the annals of Plains warfare. As the sun climbed higher, Custer made his fateful decision to divide his forces. Major Marcus Reno would lead 3 companies to attack the southern end of the village, while Captain Frederick Benteen would take 3 companies to scout the hills to the south. Custer himself would take 5 companies along the eastern side of the river, planning to strike the village from the north. It was a strategy that had worked before against smaller groups, but the sheer size of the encampment below should have warned him that this day would be different. The morning air grew heavy with an otherworldly stillness, as if the very earth held its breath. Native American sentries had spotted the approaching cavalry columns hours earlier, and runners had carried word throughout the massive camp. Warriors who had been watering their horses or tending to their weapons suddenly melted into the landscape, becoming one with the tall grass and rolling hills. The trap was being set, though neither side fully understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. In the Cheyenne camp, War Chief Timon gathered his warriors and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. The spirits of their ancestors demanded that they fight not just for their own survival, but for the preservation of their way of life. The sacred pipe was passed among the warriors, each man taking a solemn oath to fight with the courage of their forebears. The time for negotiation and retreat had passed. This would be a battle that would determine the fate of the Plains tribes for generations to come. The wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of war drums. The Howling Plains had earned their name from the eternal winds that swept across the vast expanse of prairie. But on this day, the howling would come from the voices of warriors charging into battle and the cries of men facing their mortality. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become one of the most controversial and debated battles in American military history. A battle whose echoes would resonate through the ages and whose participants would become legends walking among the living. The first shots rang out at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, shattering the deceptive calm that had settled over the Little Bighorn Valley. Major Marcus Renault's cavalry charge into the southern end of the village met with immediate and overwhelming resistance. What should have been a swift strike against a defenseless camp instead became a desperate fight for survival as hundreds of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors emerged from concealment, like phantoms materializing from the earth itself. Renault's men, expecting to find women and children fleeing in panic, instead faced a wall of rifle fire and arrows that seemed to come from every direction. The major, a competent but cautious officer, quickly realized that his intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. This was no small band of hostiles, but a massive gathering of the finest warriors the Plains tribes had ever assembled. His horses reared and screamed as bullets whistled through the air, and within minutes, several of his men lay dead or dying in the tall grass. The retreat across the Little Bighorn River became a nightmare of confusion and terror. Warriors on painted ponies pursued the fleeing cavalrymen, their war cries echoing across the water as they struck down soldiers who had lost their mounts. Reno's command, once a proud unit of the 7th Cavalry, dissolved into a panicked mob of men fighting for their lives. Those who reached the far banks scrambled up the bluffs, seeking any defensible position where they might make a stand. Meanwhile, 5 miles downstream, George Armstrong Custer led his battalion of 210 men along the eastern ridge overlooking the massive encampment. Through the dust and smoke rising from Reno's engagement, Custer could see the true scope of what lay before them. The village stretched for nearly 3 miles along the river, containing not the few hundred warriors he had expected, but thousands of the finest fighting men from across the northern plains. Crazy Horse, the legendary Oglala war leader whose name had become synonymous with Native American resistance, watched the approaching cavalry from his position near the river. His warriors, painted for war and mounted on their fastest ponies, awaited his signal. The trap that had been set for Reno was only the beginning. Now came the main event. Crazy Horse raised his war lance, adorned with eagle feathers and sacred symbols, and gave the signal that would unleash a torrent of warriors upon Custer's unsuspecting command. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that demonstrated the sophisticated military tactics of the Plains tribes. Warriors swept up from the river valley while others emerged from hidden positions in the coulees and ravines that scarred the landscape. Custer's men, trained for conventional warfare against European opponents, found themselves facing an enemy that fought with the fluid tactics of guerrilla warfare perfected over generations of intertribal conflict. As noted in historical accounts from the Smithsonian Institution, the battle represented a clash between two entirely different military philosophies. The cavalry's rigid formations and textbook maneuvers proved inadequate against an enemy that flowed like water around their positions, striking hard and fast before melting away into the landscape. The Native American warriors, fighting on their home ground and defending their families and way of life, possessed a motivation and tactical flexibility that the army had never encountered on such a scale. The sound of battle grew to a thunderous crescendo as more warriors joined the fight. Sitting Bull, though not directly participating in the combat due to his age and spiritual role, moved among the camps inspiring the people and ensuring that ammunition and fresh warriors reached the battle lines. His presence alone seemed to infuse the fighters with supernatural courage, and stories would later emerge of warriors performing impossible feats of bravery and skill. Captain Miles Keogh's company found themselves surrounded on a small knoll, their horses dead or dying around them. The Irish-born officer, a veteran of the Civil War, organized his men into a defensive circle, but the overwhelming numbers of attacking warriors made their position untenable. One by one, the blue-clad soldiers fell, their Springfield carbines no match for the rapid-fire capabilities of the repeating rifles many warriors had acquired through trade in previous battles. Tamoon, the Cheyenne war chief, later described the battle as unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The very air seemed to vibrate with the energy of combat, and the earth itself appeared to tremble beneath the hooves of charging ponies and the feet of running warriors. The spiritual significance of the moment was not lost on the Native American fighters. They understood that this battle would determine whether their children would grow up free or as prisoners on government reservations. As the afternoon wore on, the tactical situation became increasingly desperate for the cavalry, cut off from water and ammunition resupply, facing an enemy that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Custer's men began to realize that this would not be another glorious victory to add to their commander's reputation. The golden-haired general who had survived the Civil War and numerous Indian campaigners was about to face his greatest and final test on the windswept plains of Montana Territory. The battle reached its crescendo as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked grass of the Little Bighorn Valley. Custer's command had been methodically surrounded and compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter on the ridge that would forever bear his name. The sound of gunfire had become a constant roar, punctuated by the war cries of charging warriors and the screams of wounded horses. From his position among the rocks and sagebrush, Custer could see the full magnitude of his miscalculation. The village below swarmed with activity as warriors continued to emerge from lodges and riding positions, their numbers seemingly endless. Women and children had fled to safety, but not before many of the women had armed themselves and joined the fight. This was total war, fought with the desperate fury of a people making their last stand against extinction. Gall, the fierce Hunkpapa war chief who had lost his family in previous cavalry attacks, led charge after charge against the tightening circle of soldiers. His massive frame, painted with symbols of war and vengeance, seemed to make him invulnerable to the bullets that whistled around him. Behind him rode warriors who had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, men who had been taught from childhood that death in battle, defending their people, was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. The tactical brilliance of the Native American attack became apparent as the battle progressed. Unlike the frontal assaults favored by European military doctrine, the warriors employed a fluid, decentralized approach that maximized their mobility and minimized their exposure to concentrated firepower. Small groups of fighters would dash forward, deliver devastating attacks, and then withdraw before the cavalry could respond effectively. This constant pressure from multiple directions prevented the soldiers from organizing any coherent campaign. Boston Custer, the general's younger brother, fell with a bullet through his chest while attempting to carry ammunition to an isolated group of soldiers. His death was witnessed by several Lakota warriors, who later spoke of the young man's courage in his final moments. The personal tragedy of the Custer family was unfolding in real time, as brother after brother fell defending positions that could not be held. According to tribal accounts recorded by historians in later years, the spiritual dimension of the battle was as important as the physical combat. Many warriors reported visions during the fighting, seeing the spirits of their ancestors fighting alongside them. The sacred nature of the land they were defending, combined with the prophecies of Sitting Bull and other holy men, created an atmosphere of supernatural intensity that seemed to transcend ordinary warfare. Ray Nindeface, a Hunkpapa warrior whose very name struck terror into the hearts of frontier soldiers, moved through the battle like a force of nature. His reputation for taking scalps and his sworn vengeance against the 7th Cavalry made him a particular terror to the surrounded troopers. The psychological warfare employed by the Native Americans was as effective as their military tactics, creating panic and despair among men who had never faced such determined and skilled opponents. As the circle of soldiers grew smaller, the ammunition began to run low. The Springfield carbines used by the cavalry were single-shot weapons that required precious seconds to reload, while many of the warriors carried repeating rifles that could fire multiple rounds without reloading. This technological disparity, combined with the tactical advantages held by the Native Americans, created a situation where the outcome became increasingly inevitable. Captain Tom Custer, George's older brother and a recipient of 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, organized a desperate charge attempting to break through the encircling warriors and reach the river. The effort was doomed from the start, as hundreds of mounted warriors closed in from all sides. Tom fell with multiple wounds, his body later found alongside those of his men who had followed him in the hopeless assault. The battle had become a methodical destruction of one of the Army's most famous units. Each defensive position was systematically overrun, each pocket of resistance eliminated with ruthless efficiency. The warriors, fighting for their families and their way of life, showed no mercy to an enemy they viewed as invaders and destroyers of their sacred lands. The retribution for years of broken treaties and massacred villagers was being exacted with interest. White Man Runs-Him, a Crow scout who had been dismissed by Custer before the battle, watched from a distant ridge as the 7th Cavalry was systematically destroyed. His later testimony would provide crucial insights into the tactical progression of the battle, though his accounts would be disputed by military historians, who found it difficult to accept that a savage enemy could so completely outmaneuver trained soldiers. As the sun reached its zenith in the western sky, the sound of gunfire began to diminish. The great battle that had raged for hours was entering its final phase. The Howling Plains, which had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations of warriors, was about to claim its most famous victims. The ghosts of future legend were being born in the dust and smoke of combat, spirits that would march beneath the moon for generations to come. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and blood across the battlefield, mixing with the eternal fragrances of sage and prairie grass. Soon a terrible silence would fall over the ridge, broken only by the morning songs of the victorious warriors and the eternal whisper of the wind. Through the grass where so many brave men had fallen, the final moments of the Battle of the Little Bighorn unfolded with the inexorable certainty of a Greek tragedy. As the sun began its descent toward the Montana horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson that seemed to mirror the blood-soaked earth below, the last vestiges of Custer's command made their desperate stand on the wind-swept ridge. The circle of blue-clad soldiers had shrunk to fewer than 40 men, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their hopes for survival extinguished like candles in a hurricane. George Armstrong Custer, the boy general of the Civil War who had led charges against Confederate cavalry and carved out a reputation as one of the Army's most aggressive commanders, now faced his final test. His buckskin jacket was torn and stained with dust and blood, his famous golden locks matted with sweat and grime. Around him, the survivors of his battalion crouched behind the bodies of their fallen horses, their faces drawn with exhaustion and the terrible knowledge that no relief was coming. The Native American warriors, sensing the approaching end, intensified their assault. Crazy Horse, the legendary Oglala war leader whose name would become synonymous with Native American resistance, led a final charge that swept across the ridge like a prairie fire. His war cry, echoing across the battlefield, seemed to summon the spirits of all the warriors who had ever fought to defend their homeland. Behind him rode men whose names would be remembered in tribal histories for generations: He-Dog, Low-Dog, and American Horse, each a veteran of countless battles against the encroaching white civilization. The archaeological evidence discovered decades later would tell the story of those final minutes with scientific precision. Spent cartridge cases scattered across the ridge revealed the desperate last stand of men who knew they were about to die. The pattern of artifacts suggested a fighting retreat that gradually compressed into an ever smaller perimeter, with individual soldiers making their last stand wherever they fell. The physical evidence corroborated the oral histories of the Native American participants, creating a remarkably detailed picture of the battle's conclusion. Captain Miles Keogh, commanding Company 1 of the 7th Cavalry, died beside his horse Comanche, the only survivor from his unit who would live to tell the tale. The Irish-born officer, a veteran of the Papal Army and the American Civil War, met his ends with the same courage he had shown in battles across 2 continents. His body, found days later by the relief column, bore testimony to the fierce fighting that had characterized the final moments of the engagement. Young Hawker Aarikara, a scout, who had remained loyal to the army despite his tribal affiliations, witnessed the death of Longhair himself. According to his later testimony, Custer fought with desperate courage to the very end, his revolvers blazing as warriors closed in from all sides. The general's death marked the effective end of organized resistance, though individual soldiers continued to fight until the last cartridge was fired and the last breath drawn. The spiritual significance of the moment was not lost on the Native American participants. Many warriors later spoke of seeing the spirits of their ancestors fighting alongside them, and the battle took on an almost mystical quality in tribal memory. The defeat of the 7th Cavalry was seen as a validation of Sitting Bull's prophetic visions and proof that the Great Spirit still watched over his red children. The victory, however, came at a cost that would soon become apparent. As reported by contemporary military historians, the tactical lessons of the Little Bighorn would reshape American military doctrine for generations to come. The battle demonstrated the dangers of dividing forces in the face of an unknown enemy, the importance of intelligence gathering, and the folly of underestimating opponents based on racial prejudice. The Army's assumption that Native American warriors were inherently inferior to trained soldiers had been shattered along with the 7th Cavalry. The aftermath of the battle was as significant as the fighting itself. Moon, the Cheyenne war chief, later described the eerie silence that fell over the battlefield once the shooting stopped. The ridge that had echoed with gunfire and war cries was now occupied only by the dead and the circling ravens. The warriors, their victory complete, began the process of gathering their own wounded and dead, preparing them for the journey to the spirit world according to ancient traditions. Sitting Bull, the spiritual leader whose visions had foretold the victory, moved among the battlefield performing ceremonies for the fallen. His presence sanctified the ground, transforming a site of violence into a sacred place where the spirits of brave men from both sides would forever rest. The holy man's prayers were said for all the dead, recognizing that courage in battle was worthy of honor regardless of the color of a man's skin. The women of the village, who had waited in tense anticipation throughout the battle, now emerged to search for their husbands and sons among the warriors. The victory celebration was tempered by grief for their own losses, and the traditional mourning songs mixed with cries of triumph. The complex emotions of the moment reflected the bittersweet nature of the victory. They had won a great battle, but all participants understood that this victory might ultimately seal their fate. As darkness fell over the Howling Plains, the first chapter of the legend was complete. The ghosts of the 7th Cavalry had joined the eternal march of spirits across the Montana landscape, their story destined to be told and retold for generations to come. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. The dawn following the Battle of the Little Bighorn rose over a landscape transformed by violence and death. The June 26th sun cast its early light across the ridge where George Armstrong Custer and his men had made their final stand, illuminating a scene that would be burned into the memory of all who witnessed it. The bodies of 210 soldiers lay scattered across the bloodstained grass, their blue uniforms now darkened with dust and gore, their weapons silent forever. The Native American coalition that had achieved this unprecedented victory began the somber task of counting their own losses and honoring their fallen warriors. Despite the overwhelming nature of their triumph, the tribes had not escaped unscathed. Dozens of their finest fighters had fallen in the battle, men whose courage and skill had been legendary even before they faced the 7th Cavalry. The traditional mourning rituals began immediately, with women cutting their hair and slashing their arms in grief, their keening wails mixing with the songs of victory. Sitting Bull, the revered holy man whose visions had predicted this great victory, walked among the dead with a heavy heart. His prophecy had been fulfilled, but the spiritual leader understood the terrible price that would be exacted for this triumph. The white man's government would not accept such a devastating defeat without seeking overwhelming revenge. The very completeness of the victory would ensure that the full might of the United States Army would be brought to bear against the Plains tribes. The logistics of the aftermath proved as challenging as the battle itself. The massive encampment that had housed nearly 3,000 warriors and their families began to break up almost immediately. The various tribal groups, united for this moment of triumph, now had to consider their individual survival. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders understood that staying together made them a target too large to ignore, while scattering would make them harder to find and destroy. Captain Frederick Benteen, who had survived the battle with his detachment several miles away, arrived at the scene of devastation with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The veteran officer, who had served with distinction throughout the Civil War, had never witnessed such complete destruction of a military unit. His later testimony would provide crucial insights into the tactical errors that had led to the disaster. Though his criticism of Custer's leadership would generate controversy for decades, the discovery of the battlefield by the relief column led by General Alfred Terry created a sensation that reverberated across the nation. The newspapers, which had been filled with optimistic reports about the Indian campaigns, suddenly found themselves reporting the most devastating military defeat in the history of the Indian Wars. The shock of Custer's last stand, as it immediately became known, shattered the American public's confidence in the Army's ability to subdue the Plains tribes. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the National Archives, the political ramifications of the defeat were immediate and the Grant administration, already facing criticism for its handling of Reconstruction and various corruption scandals, found itself under intense pressure to explain how such a disaster had occurred. The Army's reputation for invincibility on the frontier had been shattered, and demands for revenge echoed from coast to coast. The Native American participants in the battle understood that their victory had sealed their fate. Crazy Horse, the tactical genius who had orchestrated much of the assault, spoke prophetically of the consequences that would follow. The government that had been content to fight a limited war against the Plains tribes would now commit unlimited resources to their destruction. The victory at the Little Bighorn had won them a battle but guaranteed they would lose the war. The aftermath also revealed the complex emotions that war creates in human hearts. Many of the Native American warriors who had fought with such ferocity expressed respect for the courage shown by their enemies. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, whatever their mission, had died bravely defending their positions. This recognition of mutual courage became part of the oral tradition that preserved the memory of the battle in tribal culture. The women of the tribes, who had waited in terror throughout the fighting, now faced the prospect of permanent exile from their homeland. The victory that had saved their families in the short term had condemned them to life as fugitives. The Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota and coveted by gold miners, would never again be safe for their people. The traditional hunting grounds that had sustained their way of life for generations would soon be overrun by soldiers and settlers. Rainian, the Hunkpapa warrior whose reputation for ferocity had made him a legend even before the battle, understood that the great victory had come at a terrible cost. The unity that had made triumph possible was already dissolving as practical considerations forced the tribes to scatter. The massive village that had seemed so powerful just hours before was now breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The spiritual leaders of the various tribes performed ceremonies to honor the dead and prepare for the trials ahead. The battle had been won through the intervention of the Great Spirit, but the same spiritual forces that had granted victory now demanded that the people prepare for suffering. The ghost dance, which would emerge in later years as a response to the destruction of Native American culture, had its roots in the bittersweet victory at the Little Bighorn. As the sun set on June 26, the last great victory of the Plains Indians was already transforming into the first chapter of their final defeat. The ghosts of the 7th Cavalry would march across the howling plains for generations to come, but they would be joined by the spirits of thousands of Native Americans, who would pay the ultimate price for this moment of triumph. The battle was over, but the legend was just beginning. The years that followed the Battle of the Little Bighorn transformed the windswept plains of Montana into a landscape haunted by memory and legend. The massive military response that Sitting Bull had predicted came with devastating swiftness, as the United States government mobilized unprecedented resources to crush the Plains tribes forever. Within months of Custer's defeat, columns of soldiers numbering in the thousands swept across the northern plains, pursuing the scattered bands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who had participated in the great victory. The retribution was swift and merciless. Crazy Horse, the tactical genius who had orchestrated the destruction of the 7th Cavalry, was finally forced to surrender in the spring of 18. His death, while allegedly trying to escape from custody, became another chapter in the tragic aftermath of the battle. The great war chief who had never been defeated in battle was struck down by a bayonet in a melee at Camp Robinson, his death marking the effective end of organized resistance on the northern plains. Sitting Bull, the spiritual leader whose visions had foretold the victory, fled to Canada with his followers, seeking sanctuary beyond the reach of American vengeance. For 4 years, the great chief lived in exile, his people slowly starving as the buffalo herds that had sustained them for generations were systematically exterminated. The deliberate destruction of the buffalo was a calculated strategy designed to force the Plains tribes into submission by destroying their economic foundation. The battlefield itself became a pilgrimage site almost immediately after the fighting ended. Soldiers, journalists, and curiosity seekers made their way to the remote ridge where Custer had fallen, creating a steady stream of visitors to what had become hallowed ground. The bones of the fallen cavalrymen, hastily buried in shallow graves, were repeatedly disturbed by souvenir hunters and wild animals, creating a macabre spectacle that offended sensibilities across the nation. As documented by the War Department's official reports, the investigation into the causes of the disaster revealed a pattern of tactical errors and intelligence failures that had made the defeat almost inevitable. Custer's division of his forces, His rejection of additional troops and Gatling guns, and his fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's strength and capabilities had created the conditions for catastrophe. The battle became a case study in military schools, teaching future officers the dangers of hubris and the importance of proper reconnaissance. The Native American survivors of the battle scattered to the winds, their great alliance shattered by the practical necessities of survival. Many warriors who had fought with such distinction at the Little Bighorn died in obscurity on government reservations, their war honors forgotten by a society that preferred to remember them as savage enemies rather than courageous defenders of their homeland. The oral histories of the battle, preserved in tribal memory, provided a counter-narrative to the official accounts that dominated popular culture. The legend of Custer's last stand grew with each passing year, becoming a central myth of American frontier history. The boy general was transformed from a reckless glory-seeker into a martyred hero, his tactical failures forgotten in favor of romantic narratives about his courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice. Even as the historical record revealed a more complex and troubling truth, the ghosts of the Little Bighorn took on a life of their own in popular culture. Dime novels, newspaper accounts, and eventually Hollywood movies created a mythology around the battle that bore little resemblance to the actual events. The Native American participants were transformed into faceless, their tactical brilliance and moral courage erased from the popular narrative. The true story of the battle became buried beneath layers of legend and propaganda. Yet for those who visited the battlefield, especially in the quiet hours before dawn or after sunset, the presence of the dead remained palpable. The wind that gave the Howling Plains their name seemed to carry the voices of fallen warriors, both Native American and cavalry, calling across the years to tell their stories. Local residents reported seeing figures in blue uniforms marching across the ridge on moonlit nights, the ghostly remnants of the 7th Cavalry still fighting their eternal battle. The establishment of the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in the 20th century represented an attempt to preserve and interpret the site for future generations. The addition of memorials to the Native American participants marked a belated recognition of their courage and sacrifice, though the dominant narrative still focused on the tragedy of the cavalry's defeat rather than the triumph of indigenous resistance. Modern archaeological investigations have revealed details about the battle that oral histories had preserved for over a century. The scientific analysis of artifacts found on the battlefield has confirmed many aspects of Native American accounts that had been dismissed by earlier historians. The pattern of cartridge cases and bullet fragments has revealed the tactical sophistication of the Native American attack and the desperation of the cavalry's final stand. The spiritual significance of the battlefield remains strong among Native American communities, who continue to visit the site to honor their ancestors and maintain connection with their heritage. The graves of the fallen cavalry soldiers, marked by white headstones scattered across the ridge, serve as a reminder of the human cost of the westward expansion that defined 19th century America. As the wind continues to blow across the Montana plains, carrying the scent of sage and the whisper of prairie grass, the ghosts of the Little Bighorn continue their eternal march. The battle that ended in a matter of hours on June 25, 18, created legends that will endure as long as people remember the clash between two civilizations on the American frontier. The Howling Plains have become a repository of memory, where the spirits of brave men from both sides continue to walk beneath the moon, their stories forever intertwined in the mythology of the American West. The battle that was meant to be a simple police action against hostile Indians became instead a defining moment in American history, a reminder that courage exists in all cultures and that the price of empire is always paid in blood. The ghosts still march, and their stories still demand to be told.